Follow us on social media and please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any updates from our ALS experts.
All right. A fine day to see all of you. Isn't it amazing that we can be this close in these squares? And so I see some smiles. So does everybody know the science of a smile? And that's when you're not smiling, put a smile on your face and just see what happens. Science project. Let me know how it works. I'll see you when you're smiling and when you're not. So welcome aboard, everybody. It's all yours, Lisa.
Thanks, Finn. Welcome, everyone. We have a big night tonight. I'm Lisa Deegan, for those who don't know me, and I'm part of the Everything ALS team from the very beginning. And as most of you know, our whole team has been affected by ALS. I lost my younger brother. It's been almost 4 years. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. So thank you for joining us for tonight's ALS talk series featuring our guest, Dr. Ginzi Andrews from Columbia University. After Dr. Andrews has her presentation followed by Q&A, we are going to have Sandy Morris and some of her I Am ALS team talk about the Morris Principles as part of an I Am ALS initiative created by people who are affected and living with ALS. So we work hard at Everything ALS to bring the community the top experts to share the latest in ALS research, clinical trials, treatments in the pipeline, and care for ALS. And we also work hard bringing the ALS community to the experts because they really want to hear from you guys. So we've provided plenty of time in all of our talks to have Q&A where you can get a lot of value getting your questions answered. So our goal here is to accelerate treatments for ALS, and we are so excited about the project or the progress of our speech study. So thank you to our community. We're reaching the finish line, so please sign up to participate. Tell a friend to join in as well at everythingals.org/research. I just wanted to briefly explain what our research is and why it's important and how we can help accelerate treatments for ALS and why it's so important for people to get involved. So the why is obvious. The ALS clock is ticking and biomarkers are needed in ALS. And so because of our collaborative work and our great partnerships, we've been able to work at lightning speed in 6 months. We went from the origination of this project to completion, 2 publications, and being recognized at the largest speech conference in the world. And currently we have about 760 participants. So we're reaching the finish line. So we work with a startup called Modality.ai, and they developed an application that basically you can access through a web browser on your computer or tablet. And all you do is talk to a virtual assistant for about 5 minutes or so, and it takes you through a conversational test. Through this test, the output is an assessment. So it's like a lab test or a neurological test, and it measures in certain categories how you're performing. So it measures things like speech, finger movement, your jaw movement, facial metrics. So how can this help to accelerate treatments? So we have 2 publications that shows early results that show a large variety of speech and facial measures show the signals that are correlated with the ALS FRS scores. So we're able to turn the data into scientific insights quickly. Our data is something your physicians can interpret. We share it with you so you can track progress, and we share our findings with all researchers. So this is going to expedite the right markers with so much data being collected. And pharma and the FDA can use this to render approval for these biomarkers. So you could also check out our podcast, Stories and Innovations in ALS, where we share stories like Modality.ai, who is doing great work in helping to accelerate treatments for ALS. So there's big news, and I'm going to put this in our chat from Stanford Medicine, the discovery of hundreds of genes that are potentially associated with ALS that are helping to steer scientists towards treatments. So there's about 700 genes that they have discovered. And I'm going to put in the chat where you can go to read more on this. This is with Michael Schneider from Stanford, Dr. Michael Schneider, and Dr. Jonathan Cooper-Knock from Sheffield University. They both co-authored this publication, and actually Jonathan Cooper-Knock was on previously on our webinar, and we have Dr. Michael Schneider coming on soon. So this is great news. So we'll put that in the chat for you. And if you missed any of our webinars, like our Act for ALS, which was earlier this month, you can catch them all on our YouTube channel or our website. So let's get to our guest. Thank you for being so patient. Our guest this evening is Dr. Ginzi Andrews. She is an Associate Professor of Neurology in the Division of Neuromuscular Medicine and serves as the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at Columbia University. She currently oversees neuromuscular clinical trials and cares for patients with neuromuscular disease, primarily with ALS. Dr. Andrews has extensive experience in all phases of human clinical trials and drug development in both the academic and industry settings. She's also a co-chair of the Northeastern ALS Consortium and on the National Board of Trustees of the ALS Association, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Neurology. So we're so excited to have her with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ginzi Andrews.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I was caught off guard. This is actually, hi, I see a lot of familiar faces. I see you, Laura and Marcia. I see a lot of people, and I'm super excited. Kind of wish I could see you all in person. This is my first real live lecture since I had my total knee replacement. So I've been really trying to do rehab and recover. I'm not fully 100% back yet, but I committed, and so just bear with me as I kind of move through this. So that's partly why the title is very vague and says Outlook for 2022. But since I committed to that title, I really felt a responsibility to paint a big picture. So there's going to be a lot of topics that you have had presented to you. So I will touch on Act for ALS, but not necessarily the bill itself and what it took to get there, but what we need to do going forward. I will talk on familiar therapies that are already available. I'll touch on care that we all are familiar with, but I wanted to emphasize why they're still important while we try to find a cure for ALS. And I wanted to also touch base lightly on the clinical trials. You've already had a nice talk from Dr. Sakovic on new therapies for ALS, so I'm not going to rehash all that. And I wanted to kind of paint broad strokes about what I've learned sitting from different angles as a physician in the clinic, speaking to people who are going through the journey, their frustrations, sitting on the ALS Association on an advocacy level, working with multiple advocacy groups. I'm so happy to be here with Everything ALS. Not only do a lot of my patients use these webinars as a tool, I use it personally. So I find them very useful as well. And also my work with the American Academy of Neurology and developing science. So I see outside of ALS and neuromuscular disease to see what technologies are there that we can bring in. So I'll move a little quick because I heard this is a savvy audience. But if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. If we don't get to them, I'll give you my email for people to just email me directly since I'm home recovering. So I'll share my screen and just out of, as I mentioned, I'm going to cover kind of broad strokes here. And let's see if I can move this forward. All right. I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of my disclosures because of my roles in different organizations. I do work with many companies and organizations. I also sit on the advisory boards, scientific advisory boards for Johns Hopkins and Mass General, in addition to my role as the NEALS chair. And I kind of painted some of the objectives for the study, but I didn't want to have you read the slide. I wanted you to hear it from me. But really, I wanted to kind of there's so much going on in our landscape, and there's so many things. I'm not even going to touch on technology, although I had cool projects on technology. I hope I can come back and talk about the neck brace that we're developing and eye tracking as a joystick. But before we get lost in all of that, because there's so much information, I wanted to hit the basics first. And so there's two, as you know, FDA approved therapies for ALS, and one is Riluzole, which we've had for many, many years. and it comes in an oral tablet. But more recently, some people have come to me not realizing that there's a liquid formulation that has been approved, and more recently an oral film formulation that was approved. So if you have trouble swallowing the tablet or crushing it, talk to your healthcare provider about the liquid form as a potential alternative. It can be given through a feeding tube. I also wanted to highlight here that there's a lot of retrospective studies re-evaluating riluzole. So out of the UK, there was a publication looking at the old riluzole studies, seeing that there's some delay of stages of ALS, looking at that old cohort of studies, but also in retrospective population-based studies, right? So internationally, globally, riluzole is available. How effective is it? The median survival across multiple population databases in the real world showed better survival on riluzole than not being on riluzole, a median of 6 to 19 months. So, but the key is to talk about it and hopefully get on it early if you tolerate it. But of course, as we know, it doesn't stop the disease, it doesn't cure the disease. The second, of course, is Ederavone, also referred to as Radicava as the brand. It's an intravenous medication that was approved in 2017 in the US. And it was based on a 6-month study that showed slowing of disease progression. And it was based on the ALS functional rating scale. Now, remember, riluzole was done in the early 90s. That's pre-ALS functional rating scale. So the endpoint was survival. And there wasn't any effect on the functional, like breathing or manual muscle testing differences between placebo and riluzole. But here, Ederavone showed a difference on the overall loss of function between placebo and the Ederavone treated arm. And the extension study, when everybody was provided Ederavone after that 6 months, provided additional supportive data to help get it approved here in the United States. Ironically, FDA usually says if a study was done outside, they usually require a US-based study because populations in different regions may have different metabolism of drugs. And in this case, they took the Japanese study and approved it in the US. So it was a slightly bold step by the FDA. And again, this is just a review of the dosing. It is intravenous. You should talk about the different means by which you can get the IV dosing. So PICC lines, port catheters, those are all part of kind of the process and commitment to Ederavone therapy. And from a clinician standpoint, I think sometimes can be a source of reservation or hesitation from people who want to try it. And I think it's important, and many people have gone back to the pharmaceutical manufacturer to talk about, is there any other way than intravenous to provide this medication? And so in the International Symposium, for those of you who got to attend, the pharmaceutical company MT Pharma did present additional data on an oral formulation, which I think will make it a lot easier for people to take it. Now, this is interesting because when you have an already approved medication and you're trying to create a different formulation, all you have to prove is equivalence. You know, is it equal in terms of distribution, pharmacokinetics, or the behavior of the drug in your body? And is it safe and tolerated? And they did show some interim data that showed that it was safe and tolerable. And they have exploratory endpoints looking at the ALS functional rating scale. And it showed similar progression to the IV formulation, but the full data will be evaluated. And, you know, one of the nice things that we heard in just this month is that the FDA is willing to accept that new drug application, but they also designated a priority review on it. So they actually gave a firm date. And so one of the things that we can look forward to in 2022 is a decision from the FDA about the oral form, the pill form of Radicava or Ederavone. The other thing that's going to change our landscape potentially for potentially approved therapies for ALS is obviously everyone here is familiar with Amylyx and AMX 0035. And so January has been a busy, I had to change these slides like 3 times because press releases keep coming out. But the other thing is that we heard that Amylyx put in an application to the European authorities, the regulatory authorities, for approval. So they have gone ahead and filed for an approval in Europe. They previously, before 2022, had announced that they filed an application to the FDA. But we also heard that the FDA has now accepted that application and also has designated priority review for that. So again, We got a firm date of June 2022 to hear about a decision for AMX 0035. The other thing I wanted to touch just briefly on, everybody knows about multidisciplinary care, but I often get people asking me, why do you do it this way? It's so tiring. What's the logic behind it? Or are you just giving me instructions like keep my weight stable? Like that's it? It doesn't sound like rocket science. Why does it matter? So I wanted to touch just briefly on the importance of multidisciplinary care. Interestingly, I've learned over the past year that not every person living with ALS has access to multidisciplinary care. So that is one of the things I'm very passionate about, because when we do this in a multidisciplinary fashion, and this is something that we've standardized, in the late 90s, early 2000s, where clinics across the globe now provide multidisciplinary care and try to get multiple disciplines in to see somebody all at once. There's literature and evidence that has been published that show that you can modify disease progression, but more importantly, improve quality of life if people are cared for in a multidisciplinary style clinic. And so that has helped to support the development of this multidisciplinary clinic. And in it, we have practice guidelines that are outdated, sadly, in the US. So it's been recently updated in Canada, and it has been recently been worked on in Europe as well. But US is up now for the update through the American Academy of the Practice Guidelines. And I just put this up here because there's a heavy focus, and there will continue to be a heavy focus on respiratory care and nutritional care. Why? Because if we are proactive about taking care of these issues in the clinic, and it's amazing because ALS clinicians know this, but it's not overtly obvious to general neuromuscular clinicians or maybe general neurologists how important this is. But when you pay attention to these things, it can modify disease progression and improve quality of life. And so this was one of the early studies in 2006 that showed that there was a clear difference if people are able to use and get used to a non-invasive ventilator, NIV. Often people will refer to it commonly as a BiPAP, Trilogy, Voxen. Those are all brand names, but the true technical term is non-invasive ventilation. So a CPAP, for example, that people use when they snore a lot for obstructive sleep apnea, that's a non-invasive ventilator. That's the technical term. And so you'll see NIV a lot in the literature. But when you use it, you are able to see a difference in disease progression. And it's not easy, especially for people who have speaking and swallowing difficulty. That positive air pressure can be difficult, and you have to maintain expectations, start slow, start low, and kind of build your way up as best as you can. If you can get to a minimum of 4 hours or more per day, it makes a difference. And this, there was still back and forth, but eventually there had been so many small studies with NIV that it really becomes unethical to do a placebo-controlled study evaluating NIV. And this is an editorial from the respiratory pulmonary area where they really strongly believe that improved survival can be seen with NIV or non-invasive ventilation with ALS. And they discuss the ethics about not doing controlled studies. It should be part of every practice in caring for ALS. So it was a strong, this whole volume that was published in the American Thoracic Society Journal really was a strong push for non-invasive ventilation, even starting earlier before people even have symptoms. The other thing that today I talked to several people living with ALS, and they said, I went to clinic and they just said, maintain your weight. Like, I don't understand what's happening here. Why they just tell me that? And so it's important to note that it was an observation many years ago that physicians would go to meetings and say, oh, I saw a person, they were able to maintain their weight and they seem to have slow progression. Or alternatively, when people lost a lot of weight, they seem to have faster disease progression. And so there's been numerous studies in the early 2000s that look at baseline metabolic energy expenditure. So at rest, people with ALS burn more calories than healthy controls. We also know that when you compensate for movements, you're burning more calories. And there are some issues with energy metabolism in ALS compared to the healthy population. So this led to people thinking about nutrition in a very serious way. So much so that in drug development, if people with ALS who are treated with an experimental drug lose weight dramatically, it's considered a negative safety signal. And so in 2014, Dr. Anne Marie Wills from Mass General did a study looking at high calorie versus high fat versus regular diet through feeding tube, and controlled it in a small population of patients, very small numbers. But clearly the people that were on the high fat, high calorie regimen, which was the blue line, did well. And high calorie people did the best, actually, compared to control. And then another study that was published during the pandemic, actually in 2020 out of Germany, showed that in people who had rapid ALS disease progression, which is the A graph that you're seeing for survival probability, red is placebo and blue is high calorie, high fat, high calorie diet, had an effect on slowing, a statistically significant effect on slowing disease progression. So nutrition becomes a critical means by which people have control over when they go home. They can monitor their weight, and of course, there's many apps that have been launched, many practice issues that have been incorporated into the multidisciplinary care to maintain weight and try to maintain nutritional health. It becomes something that can impact disease progression as much as Riluzole. But I put this here, so this is very, very recent. So the American Academy, there's the quality measures, which some of you on this call have participated in developing. There's the practice guidelines. These two things need updating. So all of you have an opportunity to go to this website. If you just type ALS quality measures, it comes up right on Google, and you can you can review it and see if there's anything missing. One of the things that I looked at, and one of the gaps in ALS care in general, I talked to a young woman who's 27 and diagnosed with ALS, and she was concerned that really for younger individuals and women in particular, there are no issues really addressed for care. But those are things that I think we need to hear about and incorporate and update. So if you have a moment, I would review the quality measures and try to see if you can make a public comment. It's a very simple form. Next on my hit list is clinical trials. Now this is the US, and I only put here, you guys know what clinical trials are, but interventional obviously is a device or a drug intervention, and observational are things that where no treatment is given, but we learn a lot. I just make one pitch here that observational studies are super important. They're likely going to be important as we roll out ACT for ALS and EAPs, because those are where we learn about things that could potentially help us with diagnosis, biomarkers, diagnostic tests, and things of that sort. But therapeutic approaches, you had already a really great lecture previously, and it's already archived on YouTube by Dr. Sikovich, but these are some of the targets in general. I oversimplified it, but it's basically there's several trials targeting specific gene mutations, which is driving the need to change practice and offer genetic testing more broadly. There's several drugs trying to inhibit specific things that are going wrong with the motor neuron. So these are a list that are commonly put up: glutamate excitotoxicity, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, and so on. There are some drugs that try to improve the muscle and nerve communication. So they work at the neuromuscular junction. And some try to improve the muscle response to diminished nerve input. So the target is actually the muscle, not the nerve. And last, of course, there's stem cell and cell therapies that are being launched. And I just put this as a quick picture in the US. Of course, I work heavily with international colleagues on trials that are going on outside. Some of these are international studies, but as you can see, this pipeline will continue to grow. And ultimately for 2022, what will happen is as people go to get care and they talk about clinical trials, it's likely that people will be eligible for more than one clinical trial. The other things that I wanted to put up here, and one thing that's changing practice more recently, and it's kind of evolving as we speak. I just had several meetings today about how we can improve access to genetic testing. And I actually got challenged by people who are not physicians that are not in the ALS space. Why do genetic testing? What can you do? And they were pretty unfamiliar with a lot of the clinical trials that are out there. I think they were also unfamiliar with the fact that that information empowers people. It also is lost on them that, especially for young people, they can do family planning based on the gene mutations as well. So there's a lot of important aspects, and it does require genetic counseling, but this is just a snapshot as to what's happening with the genetic mutations. So G mutations for SOD1, C9orf72, ATAXN2, and FUS or FUS have active clinical trials enrolling. And I'll just make a quick note that there are stem cell studies and T regulatory cell studies. I get asked about them all the time. And T regulatory cells, you know, the champion really is Dr. Stan Appel, and he's worked with Dr. James Berry over at MGH. They're working on autologous T regulatory cell therapy. So these are cells that are derived from your own body. There is a company, Selenkos, working on allogenic stem cells. So these are allogenic T regulatory cells. These are T regulatory cells derived from umbilical cord cells. So these are naive and they're not necessarily from your own body. And of course, there's several stem cell studies. Everyone is familiar with Brainstorm and Neuron, who completed their phase 3 study and continue to offer EAP. There's the stem cell study in the US through the Mayo Clinic. They're using autologous stem cells. So they're taking fat cells from your abdomen and culturing them into mesenchymal stem cells and infusing them into the spinal fluid. And that's a phase 2 study. And there is a study planned out of Cedars-Sinai with Dr. Clive Svensson, looking at stem cell injections directly into the brain. So it's higher risk, and it's a phase 1 study. They haven't launched as of yet, but they're planning to do so. And so certainly the field has pushed to do higher risk, higher reward types of studies, both in cell therapies like T regulatory cell therapy and also stem cell therapy. So what this has done is created a little bit of a challenge in terms of having a discussion about clinical trials. So first and foremost, I have people come in and say, you know, what trials am I eligible for? And I always get excited when I can say, well, you're eligible for this phase 3 and the Healy platform study. And, you know, there's 2 phase 2 studies. And I give them all the information because there was a time in my career when I had either one study or no studies to offer. And I realized that this could be very overwhelming for individuals going through the journey, especially early in the journey, but also that it becomes hard to choose. And so I can't take credit for this list. Actually, I have a woman who I cared for who actually put this list together. She's like, it's very confusing and I need to kind of go over what would be important. And so it's important to ask what phase the trial is in. You know, later the phase, so phase 3, less risk, earlier the phase 1, there's more risk involved and more unknowns. How beneficial is it to mitigate disease progression? What is the anticipated effect? And you can gain some of that knowledge through preclinical or lab-based studies, but it is not always it's not always translated the same way in humans. The mechanism of action is important. So some people will say, okay, I want stem cell study, or I want a study that targets the motor nerve, or I'm willing to do this study that targets the muscle because I want to improve the way I function. So it's very individual to what's important to the person living with ALS. And then of course, the intuitive factor of looking at medical contraindications. So sometimes people want to take a therapy, but you know, for example, if that investigational or experimental therapy makes your sugars go up and you have diabetes, you might not be able to participate in it. Couple of interesting ones are the side effects, which often people will ask about, and how is it administered? So is it IV? Is it oral? Is it something that you're going to be injecting into my muscles? Is it something that you're going to be injecting directly into my spinal cord or brain? I mean, we're getting there with ALS clinical trials. And then of course, asking about whether there's placebo and what your chances are about getting placebo. And then other things like how frequent are the visits and how far the center is going to be important. And also whether there's an open label extension. So for people who are participating in clinical trials, they're offered usually, if the sponsor is able to, they usually offer the access to the drug to those who complete the trial portion first. And that's called an open label extension to the main study. These seem intuitive and pretty easy, but when you have multiple studies, it becomes hard to make a decision. But I will say that we have come a long way and we have learned a lot from clinical trials, and we continue to do so. A lot of our information about subgroups, a lot of our information when people say, what should I expect for the future? a lot of our information about how respiratory care and nutritional care impacts disease come from previous clinical trials. So even if a trial is negative for the drug, we learn a lot about the disease. But there are some pitfalls that we know now, and we are trying to mitigate going forward. So these are, you guys are all pretty familiar with all of these, but we know that ALS affects everybody very differently. Different ages, different gender, male, female, different regions, whether it's speaking, hands, feet, breathing. One of the major pitfalls that we've run into is because of our desire to move things quickly in the development pipeline, sometimes there's an incomplete evaluation of drug behavior and optimal dose. So sometimes we've hit pitfalls because we've taken a drug that's already on the market, say for an infection, and we just take those doses and apply it to ALS because we thought the scientific rationale made sense. But we didn't carefully study what dose would have been optimal to hit whatever target it was. And so the drug fails. And that is something I've kind of understood working from the industry side. There's some inefficiencies in clinical trials. So sometimes we underestimate how many people we need to participate in a clinical trial. So small sample sizes sometimes get us. And of course, our endpoints, we're always trying to do better. And then we kind of, if a trial doesn't work on the endpoint that we were planning to evaluate, we have a habit of going through and parsing out and seeing if there's any kind of who somebody must have benefited. Let's look at it and tease it out. And I'll show you an example. And I do have a background in statistics, so I'll try to kind of hopefully explain this a little bit better. But we have come a long way from just putting everybody in a clinical trial, putting one drug in and trying to evaluate it. So trying to tease out maybe the mechanism of the drug or some of that heterogeneity, that's called predictive enrichment. So essentially, if we have a drug that lowers, so for example, we studied Actemra, which is an it's an autoimmune drug that lowers IL-6. So if we look for people who have elevated IL-6 and put them in the study, we'll have a higher chance of seeing an effect. So understanding the mechanism of action is important, or maybe having a better biomarker so we can tease it out will give us better success. And also there are ways to ensure, often people will say, okay, well, maybe too many slow progressors were on the placebo arm, so it masked any treatment effect. So if there was some effect on the drug, with the drug, maybe the placebo were just slow moving and they kind of made it look like there was no effect of the drug. So there's this uneven randomization of slow versus fast progressors. There's always this discussion. And so there are ways to stratify. We have these algorithms that we can use now to predict progression rates and incorporate them in the randomization stratification, and trying to make sure that we enrich both, prognostically enrich both arms so that we don't have that imbalance. So technology is being developed for that through Argent Data Sciences, patients like me, NCALS, and so on, to help us do these things better. One of the biggest things that we do in ALS is this incomplete understanding about the investigational drug, trying to move quickly through the preclinical process. And I'm going to take my time here because I think I've learned this on the industry side. So it's really important. You know, we see a lot of breakthroughs in the lab setting on models of ALS, right? We see that maybe a mouse model did well with this experimental therapy, or we saw this motor neuron in a dish do really well with a particular compound. And people get excited. And I get excited too, because that means we're one more step forward. But it may not be ready to take as a person, because we have to understand how to manufacture that drug, number one, and optimize it so it's stable and it can be active in a person. But we also need to understand its toxicity. And sometimes, and even in the FDA guidance for drug development in ALS, they do afford some flexibility for the toxicity testing, understanding that ALS itself is willing to take greater risks for those drugs. But when you skip those steps, and especially if you move very quickly into the clinic, you might end up in a phase 2 without enough drug supply. So all of this requires scaling up, optimizing the formulation, understanding the dose that you need, and the safest dose, but the best therapeutic dose Those were all done in like phase 1 early studies, and that's really important to do to really gain success in later phase clinical trials. The key is how to do that as quickly as possible and get to a full-blown pivotal stage study where you get the results, and if it's positive, you can go straight to FDA. And that's where adaptive designs come in. But here, this is, I'm sorry about that line. I don't know where that line came from, but this is one of the biggest things, type 1 and type 2 error. I'm just putting it here because you are all savvy at looking at clinical trial data and journal articles. And so type 1 and type 2 error are the bane of clinical trialists when we're trying to plan a clinical trial. We want to make sure if we have a study that shows an effect, it's a true effect. So I just put here these things so that it can be forever living on a video in the future. But type 1 error is when we mistakenly conclude that there is a difference between the two groups when there isn't. And we accept about a 1 to 5% chance that the effect we saw was just by sheer coincidence. And that's called alpha, right? So when you say, oh, there was a treatment difference between the treated group and the placebo group, and the p-value was 0.05, that means your alpha was set at 5%, and you accepted that there's less than a 5% chance that this finding was coincidental. Type 2 error is when we mistakenly conclude that there isn't a difference when there actually is. And we try to mitigate that by powering the study appropriately. The power is usually set at 10 to 20%. And how we power a study is looking at what we anticipate as a treatment effect, but also making sure that there's enough people. So the more people that we have in a study, the greater the power to detect a treatment difference. So that's kind of what you're balancing, trying to find the truth. It's like the X-Files, trying to find the truth. And so I put this example, I can't even take credit for this example, so I put the stack there, but sometimes it's hard for people to understand type 1 and type 2 error. And so in the first instance, the doctor is telling the man that he is pregnant. So it's a false positive. And so that's like doing a clinical trial and saying there is a difference, but there isn't. And type 2 is when you say that there is no difference when there actually is. So this is a doctor telling a woman she's not pregnant when she obviously is. So that's a false negative. And why am I harping on this? This is type 2 and type 1 error. Type 1 error in particular is really highly likely to occur. So you are more likely to find a treatment effect if you do repeated analysis of data over and over again, and you will, by coincidence, you increase the chance or the percentage of finding a difference just by chance, by coincidence. And so I have to give credit to Eric Macklin from MGH for this green jelly beans linked to acne picture, but he's a great statistician and has taught me a lot. But that's, I think, one of the major pitfalls in ALS is we do a small study, and we're a committed group of people, a community that want to find better therapies. And sometimes when we do a study and it fails, we'll look at a responder group. And then the right thing to do is to do a follow-up clinical trial with that subgroup to see if it was actually true, right? And if it was true, it should repeat. And when you repeat it, you should see a treatment effect. If it was coincidence, you will not see that treatment effect on the follow-up study. So I'll show you an example. Now, this was a very well done study, international global study by Orion on levosimendan, which stimulates, or the target is skeletal muscle. And in their phase 2 study, they saw that the 1 milligram twice daily dose did really well compared to placebo. This was a post hoc analysis, and they looked at 1 milligram BID, 1 milligram versus placebo, and tried to understand which one would be better. So they did that one study, and then they planned their phase 3 based on it, appropriately so. But in 2020, we learned that the phase 3 did not show any difference on the breathing parameter, which was a post hoc analysis to begin with in the phase 2, when they completed the phase 3 study. Now, is that to say that all post hoc analyses are bad? I'm going to say that if you think about it and do it correctly, I put Ederavone up here because they failed multiple times in ALS, but they kept looking at a subgroup and repeating the study. And so they were able to see a treatment effect eventually. after doing several analyses of subgroups and confirming it with a confirmatory study. So the point is, when you look at these post hoc analyses, you have to understand that there's always a risk when you're doing it. And when you find a treatment effect in a subgroup that wasn't planned before the study was begun, a confirmatory study is always helpful. And how you do it, we can be as creative as we want. We got to push everybody involved, pharmaceutical companies and regulators, to think creatively about how that follow-up study could be done. At least that's what I think. That's a personal opinion. But going beyond clinical trials, I wanted to just put this terminology up here because people crisscross this terminology. So any drug that you receive before that it's FDA approved is considered pre-approval access. It's pre-approval, right? So clinical trial is commonly how people with ALS gain access to an investigational therapy or an investigational drug. And then sometimes, as I mentioned before, there's an open label extension. Often pharmaceutical companies will reciprocate the altruism or the ability for someone to volunteer their time in the clinical trial portion. So often that group of people get access to the drug first through an open label extension. Expanded access is a program, it's synonymous with compassionate use, but the actual technical term in the US is expanded access. In Europe, it's called compassionate use. So that's where the terms kind of get synonymous. But essentially, it's a mechanism by which a physician or a drug company can apply to the FDA to gain access to an investigational drug, and then the sponsor has to be willing to provide it. And there's oversight at the institution where the physician practices. So the IRB or the ethics committee has to have approval, and the FDA has to have approval in order for you to gain access through expanded access. And right to try was a recent legislation that was created, and it requires that a drug have completed phase 1 human testing. So it can't just be in the preclinical space, and it doesn't include FDA oversight. So it's just between the physician and the drug manufacturer, physician, person living with the disease, and the drug manufacturer. Oh, and I forgot off-label. So off-label relates to a drug that is already FDA approved, but it's not approved for ALS, right? So, you know, for example, back in the day, we did a clinical trial with ceftriaxone, or better example, minocycline. Back in the day, we did a study on minocycline. It's an old antibiotic that people used for acne. And so the clinical trial was a phase 3. Many people asked for that drug to be prescribed to them. So I would have to talk about the risks and benefits of the medication, what we know about it. And I can write the prescription, and a person can take it to the pharmacy, but insurance does not necessarily have to cover it because the indication is not for ALS, it's for acne. And so often people would purchase it. But the thing is, we learned that there was a side effect. So there was this bluish discoloration of the skin that had never been seen before. It was permanent. And it would occur on the abdomen and the elbows, and we didn't know. And although that was not a major risk or a major issue, I mean, it's something new we learned. So although we understood the safety profile and the behavior of the drug in a different population, the drug behaved differently in ALS. But off-label is something different than some of the other terms I talked about. And I just put this up here because often I get asked, when should I consider expanded access? When should I, that's not me making those lines, but when should I consider getting investigational therapy outside of a clinical trial? So first and foremost, I would always encourage people to talk about the FDA-approved treatments with your healthcare team. And I say that because you can always layer on an experimental therapy through clinical trials or an expanded access on top of the already FDA-approved medications. I would say you'd have to be cared for in a multidisciplinary clinic, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to talk about whether genetic testing is appropriate or not, and you've reviewed all the possible clinical trials that you can participate in. And especially if you found out that you're not eligible for participation, then it is something that you should talk about your healthcare provider about, trying to see if there's something that you could try alternatively. So off-label use is one, alternative therapies is another, and then of course, trying to gain access through expanded access. But all of this need to be considered after discussion with your healthcare team and the risks and benefits of those therapies. And here, I just put here expanded access just as a reminder. Sometimes people say treatment use, but that's not the technical term, it's expanded access, and it's regulated by the FDA. And historically, and I'm putting this here because the regulation historically came about as a means to treat people. It wasn't a means to gain research knowledge, right? And I put that there. And for those of you that are familiar with Act for ALS, you know where I'm going with this. But the goal was really not about obtaining safety and effectiveness of an investigational drug. And it pertains to this new legislation that was passed. And just for everyone's edification here, there are several different mechanisms. There's an individual, I can help a patient apply as an individual to the FDA. There can be intermediate size where there's 15 to 20 or 30 patients at a single site, or there can be broad treatment protocols that are usually sponsored by the pharmaceutical company, and they have hundreds or thousands of patients on it, on an EAP protocol that's sponsored and provided through the company. And the criteria remains the same and has been consistent throughout its life of legislation. So patients have to have serious, immediately life-threatening disease or condition. So ALS fits that criteria. The potential benefits justify the potential risks, which is true in most cases. And then providing the drug through expanded access will not interfere with the initiation, conduct, or completion of clinical investigations of that drug. So that's very important and has to be made clear in the application to the FDA. And those applications can be made by the pharmaceutical company or the physician. And so if a drug is being developed by a company and I want to give it to a patient, I cannot say, dear FDA, please let me have this drug for this patient. I actually have to get authorization from the drug company in order to request that drug. So I need a letter of authorization from that company, or the company themselves have to apply on behalf of the patient. So that that nuance sometimes is not understood all the time. But in ALS, boy, I think I've been trying to do this, and we've been doing it as a community. We've been trying to do this for several years. We've had some challenges with trying to implement expanded access. First and foremost, we got to get the drug made available by the drug manufacturer, and that drug manufacturer has to have adequate supply. As you know, a lot of companies in the ALS space are small and usually have enough supply for a clinical trial, but didn't think about manufacturing because they were trying to move so fast. So sometimes they don't have adequate drug supply, and they don't like to say that either. So that's what becomes tough from the communication standpoint. A site has to complete the FDA application and receive approval. And although there's a mechanism for it, and FDA has in 2017, they streamlined the application paperwork. But if you haven't done it before, it is pretty intimidating and overwhelming. And the sites themselves need to apply to the IRB. So I have to make a case to my own IRB in addition to the FDA as to why this is important and needs to be expedited, and I have to receive approval. So say I get the drug, I get the FDA and IRB approvals. It has to be stored in a research pharmacy. I can't store it in my closet or my clinic. And research pharmacies, and those are legislations to keep drugs safe, make sure that it's temperature controlled, that it's accounted for. And usually there's costs involved, and often those costs are not covered by anybody. And sometimes they can be passed on to patients. If the investigational drug has to be administered in the hospital, and I put this here because we are facing this now with tofersen, right, through their early access program, there is no, we have to use the hospital facility, we have to use staff to do procedures, and those costs are not covered. And if the investigational drug can be taken home, still the shipping fees are not covered. And then there is, even though it's an expanded access, it's not a clinical trial, I still am obligated to monitor safety and do safety labs or EKGs. And if anything looks awry, or if a new issue occurs, I have to report it to the FDA as if I'm doing a clinical trial. So it's an added burden on the site, and the sites are subject to inspections and audits to ensure that we're monitoring the safety and protecting the well-being of people who are accessing investigational drugs through EAP. So it's an added responsibility on top of the clinical responsibilities we have and the clinical trial responsibilities. So that is some of the challenges that have faced ALS clinics and centers in implementing expanded access. So boom, December, we all get excited because we managed to get the accelerated access to critical therapies for ALS, and it helps to mitigate some of those challenges that I just explained. But I don't often get to share those intimate details from the site level as to why it's difficult. I want to give access to experimental therapies if people have discussed the risks and benefits with me, but sometimes I have hurdles that I have no control over. And this law has helped tremendously in trying to mitigate some of these. And so you already had a talk with IMALS and Rain Archer about Act for ALS. And so the bill is making 100 million available each fiscal year to build new pathways to fund early access to investigational therapies. The focus is on expanded access because a majority of people are not eligible for clinical trials. I'm hoping that changes in the way we design clinical trials, but it also increases research and development of interventions for rare neurodegenerative diseases and creates an FDA research grants program. So this is from the IMALS website. So you guys had talked about it, but what I will say is that there's one important thing. So the bill was signed into law December. January, we got to move, and the office, the GOA, the government has to actually get this implemented and have a plan in 6 months. And we as a community got to get involved. And so the NIH has, I put the website there, it's in the NIH website, but they put out a request for information trying to set priorities in ALS. And I just gave you the quality measures early. I'm giving everybody homework at the end of this. So if you can get on this site and put in what you think should be the focus for this, for ALS and the research priorities, this will be enormously helpful. People living with the disease and caregivers and advocates are super important in providing that perspective on prioritizing what's important to you so that researchers can get to the bottom of it. So that's open till February 11th. And so timelines are quick and we got to do this. But I'll tell you, you had already a presentation about how we got to Act for ALS and some of the planning, but there are some implementation issues that we have to kind of conquer. Number one, we have to actually try to scroll the landscape and see what drugs are in late phase clinical trials. So Act for ALS focuses on late stage drugs. So not drugs that are still in animals or in the lab. The second, so that means that advocacy groups and clinical trial consortiums like NEALS that I'm part of have to work together to get the companies, get the landscape and then get them in to see if they're willing to participate in an expanded access program. Two, one of the things in that law is that clinical, so this is particular to me and our issues here as a clinical trial sites. In that law, it says that clinical trial sites have to have conducted phase 3 studies. So that can limit the accessibility to EAPs to sites or regions that haven't participated in clinical trials previously. And so it's going to be important from my perspective. So as the chair of the Clinical Trial Consortium, I am going to ask, and I have asked, for the NIH and the FDA to think about guidance language to accompany the law so that it provides some flexibility of what sites we can use to provide expanded access. So if there's a consortium that can vet sites, can we call that experienced or supervised or mentored sites? So that's going to be important. So I'll be trying to help create some flexibilities by encouraging them to develop a guidance with the input of the community. So that's why this slide is up there. And the third is a little more tricky, but we know how much money is appropriated for the law, but how much is appropriated for EAP versus all of the other bullet points you saw in the bill? That's not entirely clear. And so the inherent purpose of that law was to have access to experimental therapies. So I'm hoping that the community will communicate that priority to the NIH and also to the FDA. I'm off my soapbox, but I think we don't have much time. I mean, 6 months sounds like a long time, but we have to move to get this operationalized. And I feel very committed and I feel a sense of responsibility to get this up and running. And so I just put this here as just to wrap up here. The clinical trials database we have through NEALS. There's also a navigator to help talk through any clinical trials. So Carly Allen helps us with that. But we're also trying to create an EAP section on our website. Is undergoing, ours is a little more clunky than everybody else's. So it's going through an upgrade. And hopefully we'll have an EAP section, education material for physicians, education material for people living with the disease, and trying to make sure we're all comfortable with that. Because that's going to be something I think we're going to have to gain momentum on. And of course, IMALS has their ALS Signal Clinical Research Dashboard. It's more colorful, but they also have EAP data on their website as well. And so I wrap up with just, I was asked outlook for 2022. I have, I think I want to push the boundaries in the box a little bit. So I've done a lot of clinical trials. I think we can do them better. So this accessibility issue, we're trying to use expanded access in clinical trials to increase access. But can we increase access by just widening the eligibility criteria? Like, let's just include everybody and designate a subset of people that we think will respond to that particular drug and use everyone else for safety and tolerability data. Other diseases have done it that way. We just have to do the work to kind of convince regulators that would be acceptable. So wider eligibility criteria for evaluation in a clinical trial. So then when there's no push for EAP, we got everybody involved. And then screen failures. People who want to participate but just don't meet that, even if we widen it, if people fail the screening eligibility criteria, is there a way, and Dr. Sikovich talked about this in her talk too, about running a parallel track or an expanded access track, for those that are more advanced in their disease and may not be eligible for the clinical trial. And then I've been trying to think about ways, we talk about endpoints. There's this debate about the ALS functional rating scale. It's got its pros and cons, we got to live with the beast. But, from a regulator perspective, their gold standard is survival. And if we throw rocks at the ALS FRS, there's a potential for them to say, fine, you guys don't even like the ALS FRS. Well, we're going to stick with survival until you guys come up with something better. And I don't want to go backwards. I want to go forwards. So I think there are multiple groups. I know that I'm involved in most of them. There are multiple groups working on better ways to evaluate function over time, whether that's using technology to measure breathing, muscle strength, reevaluating how we do the functional rating scale through the roads. So there's efforts to improve the ALS FRSR. And a recent publication from the patient community on how it doesn't really reflect function. But there are ways to think about time to event or time to failure. So for example, in the lithium study done several years ago, the endpoint was time to losing. So it was a 6-month study for sporadic ALS. On average, people lose 1 point on the functional rating scale per month. So it's anticipated that if there's no intervention, somebody after 6 months will lose 6 points on average. So the endpoint for failure is if someone in that 6-month period loses 6 points, then they've considered to hit that event, and then they're transitioned to the therapy. So we rescue them off, but they don't know when it happens, and the site doesn't know. So it's in a blinded fashion. So it takes a lot of work to construct this, and it took multiple teams, but it's a time to failure. And essentially, if people progress faster than predicted, instead of sitting on a placebo arm, those people, once they hit that endpoint, will then transition to treatment. And so that's kind of, I call it a rescue or a time to event type of endpoint. Other diseases do it. We've done it in ALS, but we've shied away from it. But there might be potential there to allow people to be rescued so that they don't just ride the placebo arm through 6, 9, 12 months and not ever have access to treatment and wait for that open label extension. So that way people in the main study would transition to the open label extension and get access to that therapy. People who progress rapidly could be rescued and get therapy. And then people who never got a chance to be eligible for the clinical trial may be able to get on a parallel track. So that's my wish, hopefully, for clinical trial designs. And of course, we've already employed adaptive trial designs. That's what the Healy platform trial is all about. But that we just got to push that envelope and get trialists a little bit more comfortable in pushing the boundaries and have communications with the regulators. So the other important issues are getting the patient's voice and evidence and data generation. And so I put that there, not necessarily in a clinical trial, but if we're doing ACT for ALS and we're doing EAP, we might have an opportunity for what's called real world evidence. And it's very controversial from the regulator perspective, But if we have a way in a community to collect real world evidence to support any kind of clinical trial for that particular drug. So for example, if we have a clinical trial for drug A, and then there's an EAP for people who are more advanced or not eligible for that clinical trial, we'll have more broader information about the total ALS population. So that EAP would be considered real world experience on that drug. So when people go in for the FDA or for other regulatory authority review, they can take the primary clinical trial data and the additional real world experience as supportive data. So it strengthens and kind of speeds up the drug development timeline. But I already talked about how Ederavone and Amylyx have been selected for priority review. So expedited pathways are really important, and post-approval data is super important for us in the ALS community. So FDA is already using some of their abilities with priority review, or even in Amylyx's case, taking a phase 2 trial and seeing if they can find a way to review it for potential approval. Innovative trial designs are another important way forward for drug development. But there's still need for basic research and facilitation of that translation from lab to humans as quickly as possible without compromising data that's going to make us fail later. And then developing ways to better evaluate what's important from the patient perspective and self-reported patient outcomes, patient stratification, and hopefully using innovative trial designs. And last, I covered a lot of territory, but I'm always restless. So faster time to diagnosis is a big push for 2022. The ALS Association has developed a Think ALS tool that's been launched to general neuromuscular physicians and ALS outside of the ALS community, and we're trying to push beyond that to primary general neurologists and primary care physicians so that people with ALS are coming to ALS specialty centers faster. So that means that they're earlier, they may have an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. Offering genetic testing to all people with ALS, not just people who say they have a family history of ALS, because we know these genes can now translate into other types of diseases. We know that people who don't have a family history may carry a gene mutation. There are risk genes that we need to understand better. And so that's really important, especially since now, unlike 2 years ago, genetic testing can be offered for free. And we have grants to cover that. So it's very important to do that, especially because there's clinical trials targeting specific gene mutations. And I hit the big four: C9, ORF72, SOD1, TDP43, and ATAXN2 and FUS. Those are the four that have clinical trials right now that are actively enrolling. I also want to make sure that people have access to multidisciplinary care. So I'm slowly learning in certain regions of the US, people don't have that. And we want to make sure people get access to that care. Improving coverage for medication and care needs. We all know that. That's like the big thing. But now we have an opportunity. If new drugs are coming on the market, this is the time to engage Medicare. And CMS. This is the time to look at when that formulary for the United States for drugs, how it's revised and whether ALS needs its own category. Because right now we're sitting under CNS diseases. ALS doesn't have its own category. So it's very important for us to understand the payer landscape and then raise awareness. We say raise awareness to everybody. Anyone who will listen, I'll talk about ALS. And of course, improving access to experimental therapies. And probably I'm not done there, but there's so much more, but I'm out of time. So I just hope you guys learned from this and hopefully you found this useful. And I have to thank my colleagues who've been holding down the fort while I've been recovering from my knee surgery. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, Dr. Andrews, thank you so much for coming and talking and speaking with us. We do have quite a few questions. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can talk. Like I said earlier, my name is Sarah. I'm one of the Everything ALS team members, and myself, along with our student ambassador, Pooja, are going to kind of back and forth moderate the questions. So we'll get right to it. Okay. Our first question is, do you know if there's any research looking into CRISPR for ALS? And could this be a possibility for the research money from the new bill?
Yeah, I certainly know that there are people interested in looking at CRISPR. I get asked that a lot, actually. So our gene therapies are employing antisense oligonucleotides. Some of them are monoclonal antibodies targeting removal of an abnormal protein, aggregated protein, and siRNA and mRNA technology. But CRISPR hasn't come into the human population globally yet. But there are people still trying to figure it out. It's a little tricky because the gene mutations, the way they are mutated are different. So it's like, for example, SOD1 mutation, there's many, many different types of mutations within the SOD gene. In C9orf72, it's not a specific mutation, but it's an expansion of this code that just goes haywire and just repeats. So because of those differences, then CRISPR becomes a little bit more tricky.
Thank you. All right, well, she's figuring that out. I'll ask you a second question.
Yeah.
You talked about Radicava during your talk, and is it able to be started, or the oral version of Radicava to be started if the score on the ALS FRS is 31 or below, or is it just for those newly diagnosed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. And I'm hoping that there will be no such criteria, because obviously in the initial days that I really almost made me want to think about a different career, because it was so difficult to get Radicava approvals for patients who were requesting it. And I was held to all these kind of crazy cutoffs. But slowly over time, there's been a slight broadening of prescription, and I'm hoping that there is no such thing, because it's anticipated that people who are already on IV therapy may want to switch over, and they're already in the middle of therapy and maybe lower than 30, for example. So I'm hoping that that restriction does not occur, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, a bit of technical issues. Our next question is, there was a study when Treeway was developing oral Radicava that showed that the oral form had superior bioavailability. Do you have any thoughts on whether the oral form might be superior to the IV?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the pharmacokinetic data from the MT Pharma study, but the threshold for bioequivalence is pretty low. It just has to be equal or greater in bioavailability to the IV formulation. So it meets the minimum for sure.
You spoke in your presentation about high caloric diets, especially like high fat diets. What are your recommendations for people who are trying to maybe eat healthy while still maintaining that caloric intake?
This is a slight challenge for me because I'm a fast food junkie, but I'll just leave it at that. But I think this is a challenge for actually a lot of people, because people who get diagnosed with ALS are typically very healthy individuals who keep a healthy lifestyle and take very good care of themselves. But it is possible, I've definitely have come across people who have different plant-based diets, vegan diets, or have other restrictions. And it is possible to maintain that caloric intake, but you would have to work very closely with a dietitian to calculate. So there are foods that could fit somebody's lifestyle. So I'm lucky I have a dietitian who worked in the oncology space, but she is very knowledgeable about all the different diets and can calculate. So essentially, if you keep a food diary and then meet with a dietitian, they can see whether you're calorie deficient or meeting your target or over. And then usually they have recommendations within your style. That's the way it should be anyway. I know that maybe it's not that way everywhere.
Thank you.
Our next question is, what are the insurance implications for non-invasive ventilation? Are there indications that need to be met in order to have it covered? And do you have any advice on how patients can get it early if there are specific recommendations?
I love the chat. I'm distracted by the chat, but you guys are great. I should just join regularly. The NIV does have insurance requirements in order to prescribe it. I think the US is the lowest in terms of, and I think there could be state to state variability too, but essentially if the breathing parameter, so the vital capacity, forced vital capacity, FVC, is 50% or below, then somebody's eligible for non-invasive ventilation. But ideally, I would like to start earlier, or people may be symptomatic earlier. So there could be a way to get NIV if somebody is experiencing symptoms of shortness of breath on exertion or feeling short of breath when laying down, and that's documented in the medical note. We can always check for what's called end-tidal carbon dioxide. So a respiratory therapist has to do that. And if that's elevated, that qualifies. A home sleep study that shows apneic episodes, and you have to have a certain number, can qualify you. And traditionally, an arterial blood gas, where they do a blood draw right from the radial artery, is painful, but sometimes if that shows elevated carbon dioxide, that can also get you eligible. In other regions, they've updated their payer guidance. So, for example, in the UK, you can get an IV prescribed as soon as you hit the 80% mark for a forced vital capacity. And I'm hoping that that will change here in the US as well.
Wonderful. To follow up on that question, there was a question in the chat about the negative effects of too much carbon dioxide, as well as negative effects of over-oxygen supplementation. Can you kind of speak to both of those?
Yeah, I think this is a very important issue. Often, I think this is the most common issue I get asked about in clinic, because people assume they'll put their finger in the pulse oximeter and say, well, my oxygen levels are okay so far, but really ALS, it affects the breathing muscles in a way that you retain carbon dioxide. That's really the main problem, as long as your lungs are healthy. And so carbon dioxide can build up in your system. And the early signs are really that you feel sleepy during the day. But some of the subtle signs include like not sleeping well at night, waking up with a headache every day in the morning that's in the front, or sometimes having really vivid dreams, like super vivid dreams that you didn't have before. I know that's strange, but it's actually in the pulmonary literature. And those can be early signs that carbon dioxide is elevated. But if it builds without any intervention, it can make people very disoriented and confused. And if we do nothing at all and don't intervene, eventually it'll build up so that people eventually lose the ability to continue breathing, and they get sleepy. We call it, they get lethargic and then eventually stop breathing. So it's kind of like this chronic elevated carbon dioxide. So what happens is if someone gets sick, for example, and EMS notoriously does this, they'll come to a home and they'll put the mask on and they'll crank up the oxygen, and they'll make people worse because your body has gotten used to very normal levels of oxygen and high carbon dioxide. So when oxygen shoots up like that, the body has a feedback mechanism and will shut down the breathing. And so this is true in COPD or emphysema as well. So always be careful with additional oxygen supplementation. You know, some people may need it because they have pneumonia, but for ALS, we don't normally use oxygen. We use non-invasive ventilation because it helps to blow off the excess carbon dioxide.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is regarding the Nu9 trials, and if you can speak to those at all.
Yeah, I am familiar with the research that has been publicly shared by Northwestern and Dr. Osdenler with Nu9, and there's been continued work in trying to get that to the clinic. I am aware that they are trying to get all of the work done so that they can move to human clinical trials as quickly as possible. The timeline, I'm not aware, and I think probably best answered by the Northwestern team.
The next question is about when you spoke about genetic testing and how maybe making it more recommended for patients with sporadic ALS. Two-part question. Number one, is that just a general for everybody should just be tested from now on, and why that might be changing in the literature? And then number two, if that comes back negative, are people with kids kind of in the clear? The question speaks to what is still the risk, even if you do get a negative genetic test.
Yeah, this is actually a big discussion in the field right now. And there is a movement towards offering genetic testing to everybody, regardless of family history. And that's because, as I mentioned, sometimes people don't know their entire family history. Sometimes, like in the example of C9orf72, it can cause other diseases like psychiatric diseases or dementia, not ALS. So it's not readily obvious to families that there might be a genetic link. And the rationale for that is that there are obviously experimental therapies that could be tailored to that person based on their gene mutation. So in that sense, I am in the camp of trying to talk about genetic testing to everybody, that comes through the door because of the rapid growth of experimental therapies in the genetic space. The second question about risk to children, the reality is there's probably other genes out there that we are not aware of today. And I've lived through this because, when I first started practicing ALS, there was SOD1, but I did not know about anything about C9orf72, which turns out to be the most common gene in the genetic forms of ALS. And so it's true that the risk is lower if you have screened through the ALS panel and all of the known genes, but it's probably not well understood that it's not well understood that we have zero risk to our first degree relatives. There's always that small risk, but the risk is reduced as you screen negative for those genes. This is why genetic counseling is very important before and after genetic testing to understand what it means to you and your family.
Can you speak to any research going on at Columbia in regards to sporadic juvenile onset ALS?
The main targeted therapy that we're working on, and that's really Dr. Schneider over at Columbia, has been working because he has worked on the preclinical models for FUS or FUS associated ALS. So FUS gene has been associated with both adult onset and juvenile ALS. And so the antisense oligonucleotide therapy technology was available to apply it to that FUS mutation and target it because it has similar behavior to SOD1 and C9orf72. They think there's abnormal aggregated FUS proteins that are toxic to the nerves. And so that is one focused group that's being evaluated for experimental therapies, but there are more. And to the credit of the European authorities, they have encouraged, if an ALS clinical trial is being developed for adults with ALS, they're encouraging sponsors to think about pediatric populations concurrently, and it's a requirement that they have to have a plan to approach pediatric versions or juvenile versions of ALS.
Wonderful. In regards to what we know now with like COVID vaccines and mRNA being something that's not necessarily up and coming, but newer to the public scene, is there any look into mRNA research with ALS?
Yeah, I'm not readily familiar with mRNA research in ALS, although vaccination for ALS has long been studied, since the late 90s. And so there have been multiple labs that have looked at this as a way to see if they can prevent like aggregation of abnormal proteins before we knew what those proteins were in the motor neurons. So certainly that may be an avenue forward, but I'm not really familiar with many of the mRNA research now.
Our next question is regarding a multidisciplinary ALS center. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's important to know that multidisciplinary centers exist across the United States, but there are areas that don't have one, or they're really far away geographically. Multidisciplinary centers usually are certified centers through the ALS Association or the Muscular Dystrophy Association, or both. And so at Columbia, we're certified by both. But there are many centers that provide multidisciplinary style care that are certified by either of those associations. But most clinics, even if they're not associated or even affiliated, so there are some designations that considered to be affiliated because they have some portions of it, but they outsource the rest, still try to achieve. I just talked to somebody in Idaho where she's trying to build an ALS multidisciplinary clinic, and she asked how she could go about it with her administration. So mentoring sites to develop more in geographically sparse areas is going to be important for 2022. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. In terms of the new bill, can you maybe give an example of what would be a drug that people know that would qualify for the EAP? There have been a couple of questions about neurone and things, and I think maybe some confusion as to what technically would be an example.
Yeah, it would have to be something that's already in phase 3 in phase 3, in late phase development. Amylyx already have announced that they plan to do a large EAP, and that might be an example of using the funds to not only provide access to AMX 0035, but there has to be the other aspect of that bill. If we provide EAP with whatever drug, we have to ask a research question that accompanies it, right? So whether that's collecting a clinical outcome measure, like, for example, grip strength has recently become, or the if we give a drug through EAP, like the new research on eye as a potential biomarker and looking at the retina, can we validate that? Or taking the urine and looking at P75 in a larger broad, so we have to ask a research question with that. And so any drug that's in phase 3 would be eligible, so reldesemtiv from Cytokinetics is in phase 3 in the US. Masitinib is in phase 3 in the US. Actually, both are international. Ibutolast is another that's in phase 3. So any drug that comes along that hits that pivotal phase, any of the drugs in the platform study, for example.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Going off of that, do the VA and Medicare authorize EAP access?
Authorize what type of access?
For the expanded access program.
Oh, okay. So that's a good question from somebody. The VA and the Medicare, so they're considered payers, and technically, if a drug is obtained through expanded access, as it stands currently, there is no obligation for any payer to cover an investigational therapy because they consider it experimental. And even if a drug gets accelerated approval and needs confirmatory evidence, so we've seen this with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there have been payers that said, oh, no, until it gets full approval, we won't cover it because it's experimental until it gets full approval from the FDA. So that is something that needs to be worked out in the next 6 months as well. And it's important to ensure, but there's no obligation for the payers to cover anything that's obtained through EAP if it's not already approved for treatment for your disease.
Wonderful. Well, this will be our last question, as it is 8:30 for those of us on the East Coast, but that's what, 5:30 on the West Coast. And we want to respect your time. So our last question has to do with, do you know if there's any research in the United States regarding ALS and medical marijuana legalized?
Yeah, there was not medical marijuana specifically. So just to make it clear, I get asked this a lot, actually. So it is true that I have people living with ALS who take medical marijuana and take it for either mood or sleep or spasticity, but we don't have a lot of evidence, although the Italians published a paper that said it does help with spasms, muscle spasms and spasticity. But the active component is THC, and there's alternative product CBD, and that's cannabinoid, and it's different and doesn't have the THC component for most of the formulations. There are some that kind of mix the two. And I do know that there are some CBD related research going on in ALS, but not necessarily medical marijuana. It might be due to the fact that it is readily accessible at this point to many people in several states. So, but no, I don't know of any that are specific to THC and human clinical trials in the US yet.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you so much for your time and really appreciate all this great information. This is definitely one of those webinars I'll be watching again to make sure I absorb it all, because I sometimes don't get it all in the first round. But thank you, Dr. Andrews. And I know from all of us here, just reading the chat, it's been a great presentation. So
I can't believe you guys stuck it through. I'm so impressed. There's so much going on. I guess the big picture here is that there's so much to do, and you guys have been such, you are all champions. And honestly, this really keeps everyone, especially us in the hospital struggling through COVID and everything, motivated to kind of stay focused. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews. That was wonderful. We had a great showing. Everybody loves you. It's clear. And thank you. You've given even homework to do for everybody. So I love it. So we thank you for your time. You guys, please stay on, because next up we have ALS advocate extraordinaires, Sandy Morris, Kathy Collette, Deb Post, Shelly Hoover. Is Jenny part of this too, or is Jenny just a participant?
Jenny is part of it, but not part of this presentation today.
Okay, great. I didn't want to miss, if I'm leaving any names out, please let me know. But this is about a document that's called the Morris ALS Principles, everyone. And it's part of an I Am ALS initiative. And it was created by those living with and impacted by ALS. They even had a poster presented on this at the 2021 International Symposium on ALS MND. Sandy, we would love to hear from you and your team specifically about what prompted you to create these principles and how it all came to fruition. So we look forward to you guys sharing information and how people can get involved specifically with what you're going to be talking about. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Your patience.
And I know that it is late, so we are going to go fast. So we're so happy that you guys are here because we absolutely need you in this fight. And this is a part of it. So Kathy Collette is going to start us off with the background for the Morris ALS Principles.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And quite honestly, I should just leave that first slide up and let you read that preamble. I'm here, I'm actually substituting for Phil Green tonight. Phil couldn't be here, and I'm honored to be here. At the same time, I really wish you could hear this from Phil because he was such an important part of this whole process. So here we have the preamble, a pretty powerful statement. And Sarah, if we could go to the next slide, please. The Morris ALS Principles were actually, I think, a good thing that was born from frustration. Frustration over being excluded from information, frustration for being excluded from decisions. And some people with ALS and caregivers came together and made some good come from that. I encourage you after this, Google the Denver Principles. You'll see what the HIV/AIDS activists did back in 1983. This is modeled after that. The parents among the group working on the Morris ALS Principles, there were parents in the group, and they were the ones who really made it come to life that you can't criticize behavior unless you set clear boundaries, as every parent knows. So this is about setting the boundaries. And it was time, and you can see on that beautiful picture of the path, this is the Sandy Morris mantra of what you allow is what will continue. Can we go to the next slide, please, Sarah? This slide shows you the 5 pillars that the group came up with. I'll just let you read through those. They're pretty powerful. They're simple, but also we know that they're going to be complex to really make happen in action. So they're pretty powerful in their simplicity, but we know the devil's in the details. And I'm going to pass things over to Deb Paus now, who's going to talk to you about some of the details. So thank you.
Okay, as you can see here, we've covered a lot of ground, and we unfortunately don't have the time to go over the Morris principles in full. However, you'll have the graphics for review later. Next slide, please. Okay, so here you can see we've got, well, it's important to note that there are 4 stakeholder groups, and the principles will have different implementations and accountability for each group. And I wanted to just give you a few examples. The first one is for healthcare professionals, and we really are echoing Dr. Andrews. Provide genetic counseling and testing for all people diagnosed with ALS, regardless of family history. This next one is for the scientific and research communities. Share your data, designs, failures, and best practices, so precious time isn't wasted duplicating efforts. To the policymakers, legislators, and regulators, mandate a reliable count of people living with ALS so we can better understand causation. And to the ALS nonprofit community, see us, hear us, and amplify the goals of our diverse community. So these impact all of us. Next up is Shelly Hoover, and she's going to tell you how you can get involved.
Hi, it's really pretty simple. If you see someone or an organization who is doing it right, you can put in a request for an accolade. If you see a person or an entity who is violating the principles, we need to know about that as well. It's as simple as going to the website, morrisalsprinciples.org, and clicking a button to say, I would like to submit an accolade or make you aware of a violation. It's quick and easy, and you can do it with your IDs. Next slide, please. Here's an example of an accolade of someone who is doing it right. Next slide, please. If a name is submitted for a citation, the group will first contact them and try to remedy the situation and hope they stop violating the principle. That would be our goal. I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to wrap this up. Thank you.
Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. This is Sandy Morris's daughter, Kylan Morris. And this is actually how my mom's voice used to sound, I guess you would say, a few years ago, pre-ALS monster craziness. But I'm going to read through some of this. She'll fill in, she'll spackle me where needed, but just wanted to let you know who the voice was. So we have a new website for the Morris ALS Principles that you can see on our slide here. And so there's also the Morris ALS Principles are also hosted on the IMALS website. So really it is just an easy Google search. You'll be able to find it pretty quick when it pops up. And then also on Twitter, there's a new ALS Principles Twitter page that you can find us on too. So yeah, that they also presented at the ALS M&D Symposium, and you can find the posters and the videos linked as well. Next slide, please.
Oh, good. There we go. Good.
All right. And so what we do ask about the Morris ALS Principles and how you can help us spread the word really is living by them every day and sharing your support with us on social media, by retweeting, by doing anything you can to just, again, spread the word, printing them out and taking them to your clinics, taking them to your doctors, your neurologists, anyone on the street. If you want to pass them out to them, it's
Your support group.
it's your support group. It's just so important to see it spread, because that's how it's going to really become real in the end. And so also you can contact them at the email listed.
And so we've already discussed how easy it is to nominate a person. And again, we must say out loud, what we allow is what will continue. So if we choose not to allow, to be excluded, or to not be part of the science, then that's our choice. And I know that so many of us out here are not going to stand for that. So we ask you to stand with us. And we know that, and we've been shown through other disease states, that when the people living with the disease get involved with the science, the conversation gets better and the progress goes faster. And that's what we're all about. So if anybody has any questions, let us know. But we thank you so much for the time that you've given us today. And we know it's late, so we want to honor your time as well. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. You know what? Please put any questions that you have for these ladies who just presented for us. And if Sandy, if somebody wants to just, you guys were so patient and waited. This has been such a great, informative webinar. I want to, you know, if you want to take a couple moments to dive deeper into what the principles are about, you know, some of those slides, I know you're trying to fit everything in a time frame, but I think it was Deb that, you know, just kind of went over a couple. If you want to dive into some of those slides, just to talk more about some of the principles, to give people, you know, a good understanding of specifics.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll also say this, is that our website is up, but it is brand new. So there is a lot that we will be adding,
Okay.
including all the certificates. So if somebody's doing something very well, you'll see them there. And if somebody is not, you'll also see them there. So we welcome you to go out. And anybody that is interested, do please contact us. And Deb, I don't know if you want to speak more in depth, but I do believe that there is so much here. We could talk about this until next week, but we really just wanted to present the fact that we're not just saying that there are principles. We are here to enforce them. We are here to hold up those that value what we bring to the table. Scoot over for the power wheelchair. And then on the same sense, we are here to say that is not okay to exclude us from the science. We are powerful and we can do very hard things. And if you include us, we promise you that you will be happy about that. Deb, do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, I can just add that, you know, we carefully chose each word here, and we have these different stakeholders of healthcare professionals, science and research, community, policy, legislators, regulators, and the ALS nonprofits. We have tried to cover all of the bases with all of the things that we felt were important to the community. And I'm really proud to be part of it. And I think the best way is to look at it yourselves and see how we've touched on so many important points.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I see just tons of positive comments in the chat. This is wonderful. This is great. Thank you, Sandy and Kathy and team. Thank you, Sandy. Thanks, Sandy and Associates. The Morris principles are fantastic and very applicable. Thank you for developing and promoting these. Anyone, we greatly appreciate it.
We need the input from the community to make this successful. Anyone can write principles, but it's where the rubber meets the road, and that we hold these stakeholders accountable. And we need the whole community in order for that to happen. So thank you in advance.
Well, I'm happy to help share things on social media that you want me to. I'm happy to do that. So.
Yeah, I loved, you know, Kylan recommending that we take these principles to the ALS clinics and to our physicians. The more it gets out there. I mean, we want this to be a common phrase, a common terminology in our community, because that's where it's going to have the most success.
just wanted to add, I was going to type it in the chat, but worth saying out loud, Sandy was nice enough to send it over to us at NEALS, and we have distributed that Morris Principles to our entire NEALS membership, 130 centers. And we'll be trying to include it in our website upgrade so that it's there visible for everybody. I am familiar with the Denver principles back in the HIV days, and this is incredibly important, and I appreciate the effort from the team to develop these principles.